Observation 1 is a framework. The 8 points that framework is a question of competing methods of impact calculus. Our first argument is that this will be critical to your ground. You can read all your policy arguments. It would just be a question of defending things like utilitarianism as the prerequisite. The second argument is substance crowd. Our argument is that the attempts to frame a style debate leads to a sidestepping of the discussion in which the affirmative is not able to talk about issues that are critical to understanding the nuances of policy. Our points that the framework is inspired by debate. There are no a priori actions, but rather should be evaluated with respect to this. Our second argument is counterinterpretation. We defend a topical plan in the larger context which is read. Again, we defend a topical plan in the larger context which is read. We have a couple of benefits. The first is knowledge production. Our argument indicates that absent the ability to interrogate the way in which knowledge is produced, particularly through policy, leads to serial policy error. It also means that we are misinformed by policy analysis and education because we come to only regurgitate the truths that are forced upon us. Our fourth argument is agency activism and the process of scapegoating because it becomes things that inevitably occur. Our argument is that only when we question knowledge production do we have the tools to engage in activism and avoid the scapegoating politics that is reified in the status quo. Our fifth argument is instrumental rationality is also inaccurate. It creates a scenario where there's no value assigned to those living beings and there are only cons of a board by which we choose to play with. That's the plan. The United States federal government should substantially increase restrictions on hydraulic fracturing by mandating all permits for hydraulic fracturing cost $420 trillion and all drilling must be done with little rainbows. Fighting enforcement in all means. Again, the United States federal government should substantially increase restrictions on hydraulic fracturing by mandating that all permits for hydraulic fracturing cost $420 trillion and all drilling must be done with rainbows. Fighting enforcement in all means. Any questions?
420 blade it, what's your response?
Go ahead.
420 blade it, what's your response?
420 has nothing to do with marijuana. That's absurd.
Advantage 1. The logic of extraction. The ace points that the logic of extraction is tied to the way in which the settler-slave dichotomy chooses to reorient itself in United States politics. Our first argument is that the resources are inherently tied to the process of racial antagonism. In 1914, Europeans owned 85% of all the land on Earth. Our argument is that this policy of native displacement is particularly true in the context of extraction, which has inherently been a colonial policy. For when they came onto the land, they allowed for the thing of booms and oil towns, in which the notion of a Wild West came to be identified through the ways in which we choose to be able to extract those resources and take them from people for the purpose of having our own settlements and intervention. This is also tied in to the way in which policy played out in the modern day era in which our invasion into Iraq and Afghanistan was precisely fueled upon this idea of extracting somewhere else. Our second argument is that the Koch brothers are the latest manifestation of this control. However, it's a shift from colonialism to the process of the neo-colony. Our argument is that the Koch brothers have created a vertical empire where they literally own every part of the fracking operation. The newsletter, the pipeline, the New Star Energy Corporation, which processes it, the refineries in Texas, the Flint Hill companies, which allows for resources to be distributed, the supply and trading, and the chemical technology all are literally owned by one of the Koch brothers, which is the reason why it continues that process of which wealth is inherently an inequality in which no one will benefit from fracking. The third argument is that the status quo discourse of fracking only reaffirms the banality of evil. It is posed as the only option in the face of xenophobic threats like energy independence from scary states. Our argument is that this is particularly true in New York, in which 11 districts are being used by the public relations of fracking to be able to create competition based on racist ideologies. For example, they go to the suburbs and say, you don't want those people who don't have values getting jobs, and we wouldn't want to put factories in the ghetto. The fourth argument is this logic of environmental displacement pushes everyone to the periphery. This racism is seen in the manipulation. In New York, there's a New York mayor, Nadia Velasquez, which recently indicated that the way in which fracking operations would occur is that they disproportionately affect the minority community, something that has been continual policy. And our fifth argument is that this threat is actually real. Many fracking operations have now used the public relations firm Bridge Resources. This is headed by James Cannon, who has all come back from Afghanistan, in which they use counterinsurgency tactics against the neighborhood, intimidating those people who don't want the fracking operations in order to push them into violence. This is what happened in Pennsylvania. The Koch brothers literally bought off the damn election, paid for the campaign of the governor who now lives there, and allowed for the permits, which is why there's more fracking in Pennsylvania than everywhere else. Our season point is the impacts. The first is this death drive as a logical constitution of neoliberalism allows for there to be the continual sacrifice of this outward periphery where people like the two Koch brothers are allowed to dispossess the entirety of others. It also allows for a tantamount environmental racism in which the disproportionate effects of what we deem to be energy dependence actually allows for the continual death of those bodies. Advantage to the environment. The ace point is that if it's probably obvious, fracking destroys the environment. A couple scenarios. The first is radiation, the way in which the compounds actually leads to the groundwater allows for radiation to not just spread at the point in which the well is drilled, but actually shift upon due to the way water currents happen underground. This is the problem which has led to many groundwater contamination in places like Pennsylvania, because it doesn't just affect the houses that are near the area, but literally allows for methane to be able to light the faucets that were found miles away. The second argument is water shortage. Every fracking operation uses close to $1 trillion, and there have been farmers who have had to take the economic burden of this because they couldn't afford the water, because they jacked the prices up. It reveals the way in which corporations are utilizing those resources for environmental degradation. Third argument is it accelerates global warming. Fracking uses this methane technology, which is 25% more potent than the CO2s that inherently exist in the atmosphere, meaning it allows for the 2 to 3 degrees Celsius to occur at a faster rate. The fourth argument is earthquakes. In Ohio, there's been a 250 increase in the amount of earthquakes that happened at a 5.7 magnitude, particularly at SIU, where we're pretty scared of this occurring because we exactly live on a fault line which targets the way in which the Midwest operates. The BSD impacts. The first is that a lack of water collapses the ecosystem. Animals and the way in which aquatic life deal with the way in which the hydraulic cycle is diverted in the process of fracking, because it contaminates the key portions by which things like plants and agriculture are able to sustain themselves. The second argument is that this increase in earthquakes is pretty devastating, particularly in Japan. This is proven by the way they tried to deal with fracking across their offshore drilling. It allowed for there to be an earthquake that was so large it killed 5,480 people, along with the devastation of poverty that occurs as a result of earthquakes because of things like having to be homeless because your home is torn down by this technology. The third argument is global warming. Our argument is it leads to extinction is something that should be prioritized because it destroys the ability for us to adapt. Our argument is that only proactive actions allow for us to revert the simplification that's happening in the status quo that only increases the propensity of conflicts in the future, because it allows for droughts that allow for civil strikes. Our 6 points that the plan is able to solve. The first, that it reveals the stranglehold that fracking currently has on the environment. The second is that we reject the logic of extraction by proposing this question in the context of the settler-slave dichotomy. The third argument is that the absurdity of our plan text merely calls into question the way in which economic value has inherently been assigned to the environment, allowing for us to call that in question. And our fourth argument is that this is key to guerrilla environmental war fighting. Our position as people and policy is not a contradiction to our act, but merely the way in which we can then infiltrate the systems from the inside out to be able to critically critique the actual policies that occur so that we're educated about them.
One off, and then their framework, and then maybe a solvency argument for your time.
Nick, just FYI, one tab. I'm gonna flow your one off on one tab. One FYI.
1 second. One off and then the case order was written.
One off framework, potentially a solvency argument right up there. All right. Anybody not ready? Framework, subpoint is that the affirmative is responsible for the resolution and must prove that the resolution is true. The number one is that the resolution is the only thing given to us by the outside of the realm, which means it is key to predictability. The second argument is the plan is only an inductive proof for the resolution. It goes from specific to general. Otherwise, we would claim plan negative ground. The resolution delineates the burdens and we need to stick to them. The third argument is that the resolution is key to stable ground division. The fourth argument is that people perceive the affirmative and act ballot as an endorsement of the resolution, which means it is implicit within that endorsement. The fifth argument is that the PMC supports the resolution by being topical. The subpoint B is that the app is responsible for the PMC and the discourse within it. The number one that they gave the PMC. Subpoint is a reason to vote negative. Do not let them say oops and change the discourse. Say oops and change the discourse like a mulligan. The second argument is that letting them do that would mean that there would be no argumentative responsibility. Things like racist language would be permissible. The third argument is that any shift would mean a new MG advocacy, which is not fair because it means additionality, which is horrible because the neg only gets one block to respond. Observation? Yes.
Is there anything on top or about our plan? And you never asked us if we defend fiat.
Okay.
You never asked us if we defend fiat.
Yeah,
How would any
context
of
would
this-
defend that. Observation 2 is the link. The A subpoint is that the resolution links. Number one, that the resolution talks about the United States federal government, not the people within the United States federal government. The second argument is that the resolution assumes that the United States federal government can have more action by combining the terms USFG and should. The B subpoint is that the plan text links. Number one, that the actor that they specify is the United States federal government. And even if they don't actually advocate the resolution as a policy, they still link to it rhetorically, which means that they are not going to be escaping the link.
Question?
No. Contention 3 is metaphysics. The first argument is that Weber argues that collective responsibility doesn't make metaphysical sense because we cannot coherently speak about what collective agents do. The United States federal government does not take action that is not anything more than the sum of the actions of the individuals within it. The second argument is that there are several implications concerning metaphysical guilt. The A sub one is that Jasper distinguishes moral guilt as for what one does from metaphysical guilt, which is guilt for who one is. The B sub one is that the resolution of morality and the way we discuss and analyze identity implies that no one is morally guilty because of who they are. Rather, people are morally guilty because of what they have done. The third, the C sub one is that this makes the specification of the United States federal government problematic because it shifts the focus from action to metaphysical guilt. If responsibility trickle down through the organization from its members, then the members would be responsible solely by association, which is impossible. The D sub one is that this indicates that the phrase United States federal government should is metaphysically problematic. It locates the focus in the wrong place. Contention for morality. The number one, that morality must assume intention in order to function. The A sub one is that this is why we ascribe words like should and wrong to agents. We say things like the president should crack down on deforestation, but not the forest should regrow itself. The B sub one is that meta-ethics is the search to explain the nature of morality, i.e. what is morality and what is it meant to do. There is debate about individual rules of morality, but there is no debate on the question of whether or not morality motivates action. It is true. If morality is applied to agents without intention, it cannot motivate action. More statements can only be made about those who possess agency. The second argument is a couple. The A sub one is that the USFG cannot have intention because they have no purpose in individual action. The B sub one is that intentions are fundamental mental states. In order for the government to have intention, you would need to have a moral state, which is ridiculous. Organization cannot have its capacity for thought. The third argument is blame. The A sub one is that morality assigns blame for actions. If we say you should start drowning babies, or you should save drowning babies, and you don't, then you are blamed for that. The B sub one is that morality must target those who cause action to be taken. Coherent moral systems only attach more demand to those who can respond. The C sub one is that attaching terms like should to collective groups causes everyone in the organization to be blamed. The problem is that not everyone in the organization is responsible for action or inaction. Individuals get blamed for the result that they have no hand in. The D sub one is that this collective agency justifies holding current generations responsible for the actions of past generations because organizations exist across generations. This is nonsense. There is no moral theory that would allow for such a thing. Contention 4 or 5 is net benefits. One that rhetorically eliminating the individual by saying the USFG should destroy impetus for change. The A sub one is that notion that collective agency squash individual initiative. Collective responsibility undermines individual moral agency by holding that groups and not individuals are responsible. The B sub one is that Susan Kapler argues that focus on structures rather than individuals makes individuals absolved of guilt, leads to inaction in the face of atrocities like civil conflicts. The C sub one is that collective responsibility undermines change through collective action problems. They motivate free riders rather than having people work towards shared goals together. The result is that nothing gets done. The D sub point is that this makes violence inevitable. In a world where people do not feel mentally responsible, we can't solve for any sort of impact like genocide or the affirmative. The second argument comes from Mark Reef, who argues that rhetoric makes violence inevitable. The A sub point is that it allows targeting of whole nation through collective responsibility. The B sub point is that it dehumanizes the enemy, for example, through wartime propaganda. All the enemy is isolated as a single body, which justifies murdering them. The C sub point is that Reef says this is the logic that allowed the Nazis to carry out the final solution, and it is the same logic that allowed the Rwanda genocide to take place. All. 2 planks. 1. Vote negative to reject the rhetoric the United States federal government should. 2. The individual actors within the United States federal government should enact or should substantially increase restrictions on hydraulic fracturing by mandating that all permits for hydraulic fracturing cost $400 trillion, and all drilling must be done with rainbows. It's unconditional, we're going for it. Oh, subpoint A is that it's competitive. The one is that it's textually competitive. We don't use the words United States federal government should. The second argument is that it's functionally competitive because we use a different agent. The third argument is that it is philosophically competitive because we understand our alternative in a different way. Subpoint B is solvency. The number one, that only our framing of action is coherent and true according to the moral theory that we isolate. The second argument is that we solve the impetus for change argument. The A step one is that we remove the barrier to change by isolating individuals and allowing them to act. The B step one is that replacing collective responsibility with personal responsibility allows individuals to govern themselves in their own morality. The C step one is that we also isolate liberation. No, I'm not going to make that argument. The fourth argument is that we solve the affirmative case better. We solve 100% of case, but sidestep the question to more agency. The fifth argument is that voting negative is key. The A sub 1 is punishment. Voting for them on a perm is akin to supporting things like racist language. We argue that absolute rejection is key. And the ballot story. This does not operate like a normal K. It has a couple of functions independently. The number one is that you should vote negative for descriptive reasons. We have shown that United States federal government should is a nonsensical and incoherent statement. That is not an independent impact. This is an analytical argument about the truth. That means that the app cannot meet the burden of proving the resolution true, which means you negate by default. And the app can't prove that the plan is true or desirable, which means the same thing. The second argument is that this means that this our critique is a reason to reject a negative, even if we lose the alt or the impact level on their framework. One, we explain two different kinds of impact, which means that we meet your interpretation. Second, you still have ground. You can defend the representation of the one SIU we criticize. The third argument is all arguments exclude others. Limited time prioritization makes it inevitable. The fourth argument is that you exclude us too. You exclude our framework, which is a unique reason to reject you. The fifth argument is that questions of a priori actions are irrelevant to our critique because that's not what we're criticizing. And the app plan, I'm not going to have time to do that.
First, it's the app, which is extraction and environment. Then their framework, the links, the alternative, obviously signposting for those computers, and then it'll go to, so I have these contentions on different pages. I'm interested to see about the judges on paper. So you have metaphysics and then morality and then net benefits.
Yep.
Sarah?
Yep.
Okay. So then that's the order that I'd like to go after that. So it's metaphysics, morality, and net benefits.
You would do that.
Absolutely. All right, so I'd like to start off with the AF, advantages extraction, and then the environment. Then I'd like to go to your framework, your links, your alternative, and then it proceeds in the order of metaphysics, morality, and net benefits. On the overall framework session. All right, are my judges ready? And UCLA. The entirety of the affirmative conceded and weighed as a dissat against the entirety of the alternative. Our individual actions, specifically oriented through a group mentality, would be able to create the environmental consciousness that is necessary to invigorate a new type of society. In fact, they concede these arguments. The solvency arguments 1 through 5 talk about the ways that we encourage new types of guerrilla infighting, expose a new type of absurdity within the United States federal government, and have to act within the United States federal government specifically because we remove the stranglehold that the government places on individuals. Probably is a perfect incentive as to why not only do we solve back for the terminal impacts of their position, but also it's too late for them. In a world in which they come up in the MO now and just refute these arguments, we get new types of responses in the PMR specifically about why the United States federal government is critical and why their alternative would not be able to solve this back by merely using the individuals within the government, i.e. just fiating new types of Dick Cheneys does not gain the same type of solvency as symbolic action about the United States federal government. Additionally, their framework. First on the framework debate is the fact that the affirmative should get the right to parametricize. If the affirmative does not get the right to parametricize, then it justifies always having to be the entire resolution. The affirmative thus would lose every debate because we never get to pick out of any types of wording that is going on within the resolution, i.e. the negative has forced us into a static interpretation of language, i.e. if the resolution indicated gendered or racist language, the affirmative then must be tied to that and not have a theoretical defense of it. This is entirely problematic for debate, indicating that the affirmative would never win creates a negative structural side bias that inevitably leads to to stale and generic debates. This means that the debate activity as a whole begins to lose its funding and begin to collapse. Our argument says that independently that outweighs any of the in-round benefits they would like to perturb about. Additionally, the next argument is not only does this mean the affirmative always loses, but it's a bad framework to be able to test competitiveness in the debate. That means that you're only arguing with the resolution, which means it's functionally not evaluating the type of clash that goes on in the debate. The amount of warrants that are exchanged between the affirmative and the negative turn their framework into nothing more than a fact resolution that would say that we simply think that it is more true to do this, which increases new types of vacuousness in debate because each judge's individual level of subjectivity truly comes out in a world in which they adhere to certain facts versus others. Our interpretation is comparatively better to understand a way that methods of impact calculus should be framed and understand the judge's individual orientation within the United States federal government, and thus the links. The first link turn argument I'd like to go for is that you must fully throw yourself into the system, be able to critique the system. They merely have two link arguments and then get to wax poetic about why using them is bad. However, I don't think they've justified enough of the reason as to why the United States federal government and specifically would not be able to overcome these problems. Fully throwing yourself into the system and using these hierarchies is necessary to increase the visibility and appropriateness of these hierarchies, i.e. the soldier who continues to carry out his duties are the way the United States continues to counteract itself within Iraq and Afghanistan. Is the way that we allow these new types of hierarchies in global studies to continue, which means F is a prior question about what individuals mean. The next argument is you say the resolution links. That is not a reason as to why independently the affirmative links, all of our parametrics links arguments would be able to get us out of the argument as to why just the resolution links. That means the negative only has to come in and say the resolution was fundamentally bad, but not a reason as to why the affirmative automatically violated it. Our interpretation of the resolution is so radically absurd that we distort any of the arguments as to why traditional forms of United States federal government mentality is bad. Additionally, our framework argument indicts the notion of traditional instrumental rationality, which is a precursor to evaluating your criticism. The notion that traditional forms of fiat and thus your traditional forms of resolution would always calculate a body down to a singular number is the very notion that we use to be able to criticize the way that the government utilizes individuals. This means RF is a prior question to understanding what the individual has and the role of violence. Additionally, you say the plan individually links with no warrant. You merely say that the plan links. You have conceded the 5 arguments about why the radical embracement of absurdity would be able to overcome the government's falsification of indoctrination or authority, which means we fundamentally change ethos to be one about individuals that the government is affecting, meaning that it is not a question about the individuals within the government, but the way the government continues to rationalize and to centralize bodies outside of their sphere of influence, which means the F would be absolutely necessary to solve that for any of their metaphysical concerns. Additionally, you must use the system to critique the system. 2 subpoints. The A subpoint is scholar unification. In a world in which we arm ourselves with the technocratic specifics of the government, would we be able to provide a new type of scholar unification for the authors like Kapler to exist in the first place? That means that our interpretation is necessary for the sites of contestation that you cite. The B subpoint is activism. The groups that are antithetical to fracking in the status quo need a juxtaposition point to be able to frame their discussion, which means that the F is necessary to understand the way that the government continues to co-opt these groups. Individuals would not be able to solve that back, which means new types of absurdity via the plan are necessary. Additionally, the next argument is turn. We engineer a transition because the alternative only utilizes new types of individuals. It would not be able to be possible to reconcile the Koch brothers because they simply are able to game the system. That is the entirety of the case, which means that there is a large detriment to the way the alternative operates rather than the structures of the government, which means we're absolutely critical and thus the alternatives. The first argument is permutation, do the plan, and reject the rhetoric of United States federal government should. The second permutation is do the plan and the individual actors within the United States federal government should enact a bill. If their argument is true, that these are two fundamentally different agencies, then this is a theoretically legitimate permutation because it includes all parts of the plan and all or more parts of the counterplan, which means independently we still have a way that this would be justified. If it is true that individuals are different agencies than the United States, then we can do both at the same time. The perm would swamp the links to the dissent and has independent net benefits. The new type of multiplicity that is engaged in via the permutation framing means that authors like Judith Butler conclude multiple ideologies can actually come together to be able to solve back to the vestiges of violence and ahead conducting rigorous policy analysis in the future, which means we would be able to disincentivize bad discourse in the future. Additionally, the second argument is we recognize the fluidity of discourse, which is absolutely necessary to be able to solve back for rigidity, which is what is allowing the genocide of the transgender body, or it's what is allowing the new types of discrimination against the race body that does not meet one qualification, which means fluidity of language is absolutely necessary. Additionally, their alternative still links because they have framed it within the individuals within the government. which means they still give power to the government in the first place as a fundamental group, which means there is an equal risk of link on both sides. Metaphysics.
Question?
What?
When you say do the plan, will you defend the actual plan text as replacing do the plan?
Sure, insofar as the F is a representation and an ethic. The F does not adhere to these new types of fiated standards that you're trying to imply. The F is an ethic and a representation. That's what you'd like us to be, which means we're focusing on how language operates. That also probably means language is fluid. Metaphysics. The first argument that they indicate is that we would never be able to speak out against we prevent the ability to speak out against the collective, but that forecloses on the ability to connect with the other. The idea that we should only operate as individuals is this sort of Nietzschean devolution of understanding that only the individual is popular or should be essentialized. This is actually the logic that incentivizes Nazism. Understanding a superior race or a superior type of individual causes new types of infighting that means we would never have an altruistic connection. Their alternative independently forecloses the ability to embrace things like not the Koch brothers. Morality. Our argument says ethics would be able to preclude the very type of groupthink that are going on in the status quo. If it is true that the F is ethical or representational, that means we actually recognize the fact of human possibility. This is one of the best link terms to their position, recognizing the fact that individuals can play such a rigorous part of the government, i.e. Josh and I's rhetoric would be able to change governmental decisions. It's absolutely necessary to recognize the true strength and validity of the individual within larger power structures. It means we'd be able to recognize those ethics comparatively better, and this is why we answer the net benefits to their arguments. If we link turn their position, this violence inevitability claim does little for them in the debate.
Case on top, then alt, framework, links, metaphysics, morality, and
Can you give me that again?
yeah. Case, then alt, and then framework, and then links, metaphysics, morality, and then. Is everyone ready? They say that the affirmative operates as a disadvantage of the critique, but the problem is that the critique preempts the question of the affirmative and short circuits its application as a disadvantage because critique indicates that there's no solvency. For your arguments, you say that we concede the affirmative case, but the problem is that the critique already explained how you do not solve for the affirmative case because your group mentality ultimately leads to inaction where people do not act and they do not carry out the changed mentality that you say would be a good thing. This is coming from our arguments about the fact that people feel that they are not responsible for the group as a whole, and arguments about game theory where people will be incentivized just to free ride on others. That applies specifically to the affirmative case. On the alt, or the two alts. Group the actual alts. We'll do line by line stuff in a minute. The first argument is they cross-apply the arguments about metaphysics and morality. Their term is nonsensical because it indicates that they still use the term USFG should they use the term, but whereas we only mentioned it, that indicates the term cannot solve because it is a meaningless advocacy. We don't understand how to interpret it. Second, even if the term has meaning, that meaning is bad because it contains a contradiction. It is like saying A and not A. That indicates we cannot derive information from it, which means we cannot derive action from it and understand where to direct our solvency. Third, even if we can derive information from it, we would just as likely be supporting the term USFG should as rejecting the term. There's no reason to preference the alternative part of the term over the planned part of the term, which is the reason why they can't solve our arguments. Fourth, and their arguments about double bind and uniqueness overwhelming are not going to apply. The ace point is that their term operates differently than the alternative. They do not garner the specific advocacy and alternative solvency we garner. The B point is that they don't include both negative, which is key to the solvency that we articulate. Fifth, even the inclusion of the United States federal government guts their solvency. The term doesn't work in this instance. Arguments indicate that collective responsibility negate personal responsibility even when personal responsibility exists. If the two are applied to the same situation, which is why the collective responsibility in the term overwhelms the individual responsibility that we advocate for. Sixth, not at this time. they're going to say that the uniqueness overwhelms the link, that we cannot solve for these arguments in the real world. The A subpoint is that would be new, don't let them make these arguments. The B subpoint is that our impact story is linear. We don't claim to solve for every instance of collective responsibility, but we say we do a little bit, which is a good thing to see. It's a question of which arena collective responsibility is applied to. Collective responsibility only corrupts responsibilities in the areas to which it is applied, which is why their uniqueness arguments are not going to function here. And the D subpoint is that their argument is false because empirics show that we can overcome instances of collective responsibility in unique instances where we completely reject collective responsibility, but only if we reject that notion absolutely in those instances. And the seventh argument is don't vote on their multiplarity or juxtaposition terms. Butler asked not to be used in debate rounds, which is the reason why you should reject any arguments that are contingent on the arguments that Butler makes. And the ninth argument is prefer our solvency arguments over their solvency arguments because ours are actually specific to the question of the critique, whereas theirs are just a generic perm that they run every round, not at this time, on the actual perm. They say the first net benefit is multiplicity and that Butler says that ideologies can come together. The first argument is this is an extremely generic claim. There's absolutely no warning. Butler was not talking specifically about these two kinds of ideologies. I'm explaining why these two ideologies cannot combine. The second argument is that this doesn't work because Butler was not talking about contradictory arguments. Butler was talking about arguments that fit together, and the next argument is that you don't actually offer the multiplarity that Butler and other authors talk about. The A subpoint is that you misunderstand the literature. This is contingent on the use versus mention distinction. When we use a phrase, you refer to the actual thing. When you mention a phrase, you refer to the signifiers. For example, cheese comes from milk, it's using the term cheese, whereas cheese comes from the word cis, is mentioning the term cheese. The literature talks about the juxtaposition and multiplarity through mention, not through use. The B subpoint is that we juxtapose through mention when we use the term USFG in an alternative. And see, this argument that they're making is not clear. There's absolutely zero warrant. They say they allow for the fluidity of discourse. First argument, they did not explain how we do not meet that. The second argument said they don't meet it insofar as we don't meet it because they still think that terms have meaning. That's why they're deriving arguments. All of our arguments are contingent on some static argument. The third argument is that we are criticizing the way that you use the term USFG should, which is the reason why we still allow fluidity. We're just holding you to the way what you offered. You say that we still link because individuals are within the US in our alternative. The problem is that you are not understanding how our argument operates. Our argument is that responsibility needs to flow directly from the plan text or the alternative to the individuals in question, not through an organization, i.e. the USFG. That's the distinction that you are not getting at. Our argument is not USFG as an organization is bad. Our argument is understanding our responsibility as flowing through the USFG as opposed to flowing directly to us from a text and pointing who we are out using the USFG are two completely different things. Your question quickly.
Yeah, could you identify the individuals or the individual ethics that are against fracking and why they're better than the groups that are against fracking?
Our argument is that people don't act in the way that you explain your arguments. Go to the alternative. You can extend the entirety of the alternative now, specifically the solvency arguments, which today cannot garner with their firm on the framework question. We're not going to say that you have to defend the resolution. Our argument is that you need to defend your plan text, and we never said you have to defend the resolution in all instances. We just said you need to prove it true, which is something like that's not even relevant. There's no RVI here anyways, on the links. Their first argument is that we don't justify why the USFG, on the framework, you can extend that they need to be responsible for the PMC discourse. On the links. They say that we don't justify why the USFG needs to be overcome, i.e. they say that we need to put ourselves into the system and increase visibility. Our argument is not that the USFG as an organization is bad. Our argument is that when individuals act as, when responsibility flows through the USFG as opposed to flowing to individuals directly, that causes inaction, which is a bad thing. They say the affirmative read-links, but they say there's no reason why the affirmative links, but we are articulating specifically that your actor is the USFG. That is problematic. Additionally, you say that our interpretation is absurd and that you avoid link, but our interpretation is not absurd because we're articulating exactly where you are linking. They say the framework indicts traditional fiat. Our question is not a question of traditional fiat. It's a question of whether you can juxtapose the terms USFG and should. We say you cannot, and that is bad. You say you examine how the government uses people, but our argument is the government doesn't do anything. The government is a structure. Only the people within the government do things. The way that you answer these links are all relinks into the criticism. The government is not an actor. The government is a structure. You say we don't have, there's no warrant why the plan links because the plan operates in absurdity, but our argument is that you link by using the term USFG should. Additionally, you say that we don't question how the government rationalizes body. That's not relevant to our argument. You say that we must use the system. Our argument is not that people should not operate within the organization of the USFG, but rather we need to articulate that individuals are acting within the organization of the USFG as opposed to individuals deriving responsibility from the USFG or perceiving the USFG as an actor in and of itself. That also answers the questions of arming ourselves with methods because that is not the point of the critique. These are generic arguments that don't apply. You say that you engineer the transition, but there is no transition because it's going to be terminated before we get there. Metaphysics. You say we foreclose on the ability to connect with others. We say that we cannot understand others as superior individuals. Rather, we need to recognize individual ethics come first, and that there is no governmental factor. We're not responding to our argument about guilt in a world where you have no guilt under your interpretation. That indicates that people don't have incentive not to do things like Nazism on morality. You say that ethics preclude groupthink, and you recognize human possibility, but you're not responsible. You are not responsive to our specific arguments how the USFG is a structure, not an individual body, which is the reason why you cannot operate. Additionally, you're continuing to blame arguments, which means that people are not going to be blamed when they don't recognize human possibility or don't enact the actions of the plan, which is the reason why you don't access that solvency on net benefits. This is where we're really going to be winning ground. You can extend the entirety of the net benefits page, specifically that when you interpret the responsibility as flowing through USFG, as opposed to directly through individuals, that squashes individual moral agency. Individuals have no incentive to act because they're absolved of guilt. Additionally, it creates the free rider problem, and violence becomes inevitable because people can target entire nations. That's what Nazism is a consequence of, and it allows for dehumanization, which answers your otherization argument. Additionally, even if responsibility does successfully flow from the government to individuals, they feel that they'll be blamed for the actions of other individuals, so there's no incentive to act, even if responsibility does successfully flow from the organization to the individual. But our argument is that it doesn't flow in the first place. Here's the bottom line, though. You think this is a critique of the government. It's not. It's a critique of the way that we understand responsibility. Every time you say USFG, we need to re-examine what USFG does, that's a relink.
There's no LOR, waive it, do that.
Alright. It's going to be the alternative. The links. Action case on top, alternative links. Net benefit, metaphysics and morality. Framework on top.
Can you just tell me your
Of course, yeah.
Perfect.
Framework?
Theirs?
Yeah, the only sheet that you went to in the block. Our case, links, and alternative, and net benefit, metaphysics, morality. There'll be an overview on top. Everyone good? Unlike what UCLA would like you to believe, forcing the Koch brothers to use rainbows in their drilling operations is not the kind of thing that makes you somehow absolve yourself from guilt, but rather, the absurdity of having the government tell them to do that reveals the inner inconsistency of their politics. The PMC and the MG talk about how the settler and slave dichotomy is fueled in the status quo, where individuals like the Koch brothers are allowed to have massive forms of exploitation, which mean that only in a world where we're able to reveal that absurdity can we have a policy that solves. The alternative would not be able to do that, which is why they lose. But first, the framework. Giving us access to the entirety of PMC is devastating. We have two disads against the alternative that we'll be able to extend across later, but this is only a question of whether or not we outweigh their criticism, which is something we will do. Case. You have no links to the criticism in a world where you can see some damning link turns in our solvency page. Extend across Mike's argument how we remove the stranglehold of the government in the context of environmental security. Our argument is not that we are somehow embody the actual policymakers that exist, but rather that refusal of embodying them and using guerrilla tactics precisely allows for us to choose that individual location, which is Mike and I, to mess up the government, which is the people who are in cahoots with the Koch brothers. We reveal the sheets and reveal the fundamental relationship between colonialism and neocolonialism, which means you have no link to your criticism. Your only argument is against group action. Too bad Mike and I took guerrilla tactics for burning this thing down. The impact of this argument is that unless we're able to question these things, we allow for the death drive, which allows for a sacrificial mentality in which we can dispose of other people because we absolve them of that argument. The links. The only link that they go here is for the word USFG, not in the context of our affirmative, which means that we do not use the USFG as a process through which people are somehow dehumanized, but rather we use that as a starting point to reveal the absurdity of politics. This is conceded, and a couple other net benefits too. A reason why you can cross-apply permutation here. The first is that you must use a system to critique the system. The scholar unification argument is devastatingly conceded, indicates that the only way in which we can actually have activism where people actually feel that they should do something is by framing the discussion in the context context ways, of productive ways we can unify scholarship. Their world of the alternative means that this becomes fractionalized, meaning that instead of actually getting people to do action, you just piss them off and they become more apathetic, turns the entirety of your criticism. You've also conceded that our form of radical embodiment has nothing to do with the link you try to go for. That notion of absurdity means that we are able to tear apart traditional notions of instrumental rationality, which is something that only you link to. The notion that you would somehow posit people as valuable allows for the dehumanization. Moreover, you say that we cannot juxtapose. Our argument is that you don't have an impact to no juxtaposition. We have an impact, however, to saying that we can't. Believing in the static notions of language or static notions of politics, and saying that we cannot combine two things that seem like they would be relevant allows for us to have these static categories which allow for the infliction of violence, i.e. the way in which the transgender body is a juxtaposition of the way in which we choose to traditionally think about gender, but rather is able to radically break down the things, even when though conservatives do not think that we recall that violence impact is a dissad to the alternative, that they will get nothing and so be able to garner against. Moreover, on the alternative, I extended the permutation on the link page. I think it's pretty devastating here too. They say the permutation is meaningless, not an impact you can go for. Moreover, it is meaningful because it allows for academic unification. You've also conceded the argument that doing the plan through these kind of individual agencies means that the permutation is not, that reveals the non-competitive nature of the alternative, meaning there's no dissent against this. Moreover, you links your own criticism. You say government and with your plan text, and given how generic the negative block is, probably a reason you reject them as well. They try to say that somehow we reject collective responsibility. No, we don't. We isolate the coke industry as being a specific place by which individual responsibility is quashed in the status quo. Only rely for that multiplicity. You say Butler rejects us. Butler rejects debate. Equal risk of a link. Yeah.
Just because we said Butler doesn't mean we didn't take her argument and then run with it.
Oh,
we
yeah.
did more with it.
Yeah, Just because we said Butler doesn't mean we just copied and pasted that page onto the flow, but rather we chose to use it as ways to show in which the contradictions between two movements can actually be idealized. He says we can't do that juxtaposition. However, the example I gave about sexuality probably proves our argument. Absurdity also solves this argument, because even if our juxtaposition doesn't make sense, that's the point of the AF. That absurdity reveals the fundamental incoherencies in U.S. federal government policy. And that benefits. The next of these pages are kind of the same thing that happened on the rest of the debate. Don't know why they're on a separate page, but a link turn to absurdity solves his argument, because it is not a question of just using the federal government. It's about breaking it down through an individual action. You guys read a critique to the wrong affirmative. Moreover, go to metaphysics. They try to say this leads to guilt. This really is just an impact to stuff that's already solved by something like the link turn. We do not foreclose that connectivity. Only their ethics forecloses the connectivity, because the inability to understand how structures actually affect allows for white people to say, look, I didn't cause racism means I didn't did it, which is the critique we tried to go for. You say morality. We obviously are able to solve that back. We are not the structure of the United States federal government. I'll make that damn clear here. We are not. Mike and I chose guerrilla tactics. You don't link to this.